Section 2. Scrolls, seals, and the people who carried the empire's secrets. The scroll is not large, just a few tightly rolled sheets of parchment, sealed in dark red wax. Its contents, perhaps a grain shipment directive, perhaps a change of command, perhaps simply the emperor's polite acknowledgement of a provincial governor's birthday gift. Whatever the message, it is state property, and the person holding it, whether a dusty horseman or a cloaked palace functionary, is now part of the imperial machinen, invisible web of messengers, assistants, and scribes that kept the Roman world humming from one province to the next. In this section, we step deeper into the people and processes behind Rome's postal system. Not the roads or horses, but the humans, those who wrote the letters, sealed them, copied them, carried them, and occasionally misplaced them. If empires rise and fall on information, then these were its silent lifelines. The letter writers and scribes, not everyone in the Roman Empire could write. In fact, even among the literate elite, writing was often left to professionals, secretaries, scribes, and notarii. In the imperial court and governor's offices. Most documents were composed by amanuenses, trained scribes who took dictation, libellarii, junior clerks, who handled routine paperwork, notarii, shorthand experts, skilled in speed writing for official proceedings. Writing was time-consuming and costly. Papyrus or parchment wasn't cheap, and ink had to be mixed fresh. The tools, reeds, or styluses required training. So even when a governor wanted to send a brief report, he'd often dictate it while pacing across a marble floor, leaving the mechanics to his overworked staff. Each letter had to be copied, sometimes in multiple versions. One for the recipient, one for archives, perhaps one for internal review. This duplication was part of what made Roman bureaucracy so resilient, so slow, sealing, securing, and sometimes ... Snooping. Once written, a letter was often sealed using wax and a ring sealant impression pressed into the wax that showed the letter had not been opened or altered. Imperial letters bore the emperor's signet, sometimes along with the name of the issuing official. But not all seals meant security. Some lower-level officials reused wax or applied faint seals that could be removed and remelted, giving snoops a brief glance at sensitive content. For truly important or dangerous messages, letters were encased in wooden cylinders or leather scroll holders, guarded by armed escorts, hand-delivered only to a named recipient. Despite precautions, leaks happened. In a letter from the 2nd century, one senator complained that his political rival somehow knew the emperor's response before the courier had even left Campania, a clear sign that even then, information had a way of escaping its envelope. Couriers, sleep, and the race against time. Roman couriers were expected to travel swiftly, but not endlessly. On long routes, they stopped at mansions where they could rest and resupply. These stops, though essential, could also become bottlenecks. The keeper of a mansio was called a mansionarius, and like any local official, he could be meticulous and efficient, lazy and distracted, or deeply resentful of every courier who showed up past sundown. If a courier arrived late, his horse lame, and the only fresh mounts had already been taken, he might have to wait hours, poor days for replacements. During these downtimes, letters might be placed in wooden storage boxes, locked in rooms filled with the snoring breath of other riders and the quiet groans of tired animals. There was no express lane, no magical upgrade, only patience, road dust, and an occasional bribe to the mansionarius, the slave letter carriers of private Rome, for those outside the official state apparatus. Sending a letter meant relying on personal slaves, often trained as tabulary letter carriers. Wealthy Roman families maintained entire teams of these messengers. They wore cloaks marked with wax seals, indicating their employer, carried passports or documents of passage to avoid harassment, memorized routes and stopping places since many letters contained verbal instructions, not written on paper. It was not unusual for a tabularius to travel across regions, Rome to Gaul, or Alexandria to Athens, bearing messages of business, family feuds, or love affairs. Some were treated as elite household staff, others as expendable tools. Cicero once wrote of a tabularius who took 4 days to reach him in Brundisium. He praised the man's speed but noted, dryly, that the letter was soaked with rain and smelled like a damp tunic, a reminder that even personal mail could arrive in imperfect condition, where delays became policy in some parts of the empire. Postal delays were not just expected, they were planned. In remote provinces like Britannia or Mauritania, local officials would wait until enough letters accumulated before dispatching a courier, to avoid wasting horses and manpower. This batching system saved resources but created lag. The result, updates to tax policy, might arrive months late, leading to overcollection or rebellion. Governors might unknowingly act on obsolete orders. Peace treaties might be violated because truths hadn't yet received word to stand down. In one preserved edict from Egypt, a frustrated prefect complains, "The men of the desert have already crossed the border, and yet I am only now informed of the trouble from 5 weeks past." Even in Rome, distance diluted power, from orders to obsolescence. What happened when letters arrived too late? Most of the time, nothing dramatic. The letter was read, filed, and added to a stack. Another would follow. Rome was big. Slowness was baked in. But sometimes, delays caused lasting change. Generals lost battles because supply orders never arrived. Tax collectors miscalculated grain levies, leading to unrest. Colonial governors acted independently, knowing full well that by the time Rome objected, the damage would be done. In effect, the slow postal system gave rise to a paradox. It held the empire together, while simultaneously allowing space for its edges to act freely. It was a tether knot, a leash, an invisible web, pulled tortoise section to ends. Picture once more that Roman courier, hooves clattering against stone, breath misting in the early morning air. His cloak is stiff with sweat. His fingers grip the satchel tightly. He is exhausted, unsure if the message he carries still matters. But he rides on dot, because in ancient Rome, words on parchment moved armies. They raised taxes. They married kings. They ended wars, sometimes weeks too late. And perhaps, as the courier passes under an arched milestone, he wonders how many messages change nothing by the time they arrive, and how many change everything. Section 3. When the message outlived the messenger. The slow fade of Rome's communication empire, the last light of day, fades over a road that once bore imperial authority. The milestones are cracked. The way stations are shuttered or crumbling, their tiled roofs half collapsed, their stables empty. But for centuries, this was the artery through which the Roman world thought, commanded, and remembered. In this final section, we follow the slow unraveling of the cursus publicus not with a dramatic collapse, but through the gradual weight of mismanagement, shifting priorities, and the creeping entropy of empire. Rome's famous postal system did not end in flames or battle. It faded out like so many other parts of Rome, slowly, bureaucratically, and with a shrug. Yet its legacy of roads, routines, delays, and human networks echoes far beyond the ashes of the empire. In fact, you'll find traces of it in the modern postal systems we still rely on today. From empire to maintenance mode by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Roman Empire had grown immense and unwieldy, with borders constantly shifting and generals rising and falling like desert mirages. The imperial bureaucracy swelled in both size and confusion. The postal system reflected this instability. More riders were needed to serve growing frontier needs. More letters were dispatched as the government tried to maintain control. More checkpoints were added to prevent theft, misuse, or rebellion. But more did not mean better. Emperors now ruled not just from Rome, but from Trier, Mediolanum, and eventually Ravenna and Constantinople. Each court needed its own network of messengers, which splintered the once unified system. The cursus publicus became less public and more imperial, a kind of elite courier system for a government that barely trusted its own governors. Ordinary citizens who had never really had access to it found themselves more isolated than ever. The burden of the stations running the Roman postal system wasn't just a matter of roads and riders. It relied on thousands of local communities to supply fresh horses pack animals food and grain housing, and stables repairs for carts and equipment, and they had to do all this without pay. It was considered a civic duty known as vehiculatio, but it was deeply resented. A farmer whose oxen were taken to transport mail might never get them back. A village ordered to host couriers could lose half its food stores in a month. Over time, communities began to resist. Some hid their best animals when they saw riders approaching. Others delayed repairs, hoping the next station would pick up the slack.